Well, I can safely say that the Omega raids in Final Fantasy XIV are the best I've experienced so far. Out of the 2 raids that came before, the Coils of Bahamut definitely had the better story with the Calamity, Louis, Alphino, and Eorzea getting some closure. The fights themselves weren't bad, they just weren't as good as what came after, and of course they were really difficult at times. The Alexander raids were the opposite. By the end I was done with the story and the Illuminati goblins, but I enjoyed the fights more than the Coils. I mean, you got to fight Pepsi Man during this, and you got to strike a pose like a Power Ranger, plus the music was really good. But now the Omega raiders came in and just smashed them through a wall and said, hey, I do what both those raids did, but better. The Omega raid series in my opinion has a much better story. As nice as it was seeing the family reunion in Coils, I was more invested in what was going to happen with Sid, Nero and Alpha. And the fights themselves, I think it's safe to say I'm in the majority when I say the fights are much better than Coils and Alexander, and that's not just because we get a lot of references to previous Final Fantasy games. So if you watched me finishing 4.0, you'll have no doubt seen my reaction to the setup for the Omega raids. Already I was looking forward to seeing the ongoing shenanigans between Sid and Nero, the never-ending battle that might just end with the two of them killing each other, or getting married. Back at Ralga's Reach I got brought up to speed about the Omega situation, and we need to either get it under control and recover it, or do what we usually do. Kill it. Of course I tried to get out of it, but Nero, that slimy f***, reminds me that I was there when Omega was activated, so like all the rest of them, I need to help try and stop it. Also, Nero for some reason loves showing off his teeth during all this. So we head to the giant hole in the ground in the desert. Before it was actually empty, but now it's full of grape flavoured sunny delight. Also it spawns creatures. This little guy is Alpha, and as you can tell he's a chocobo, but he's clearly not one from this game. You'll understand why after you've played through the raids. Also, Midgar Summer decides to actually do something, and by something I mean pop up and drop some lore. It turns out Omega and Midgar Summer have a history with each other, and we'll find out more later. But now it's time to jump into the purple goop because hey, why not? We end up in a world that looks like how the internet was described back in the 90s, and I had to play through a pretty lengthy solo event to start things off. In here Omega itself speaks to us. It turns out it created this world as a testing ground to carry out experiments to find strong opponents to test itself against. Omega is literally Goku. Omega basically threatens to erase our existence if we don't comply to these tests, so yeah, I guess we're doing it. I thought we would get thrown into the raids as usual, but considering the story being told, it makes sense for them to give you some solo content to set it up. And eventually we make it to an area called the Deltascape, where we set up camp and prepare for the raids. I'm going to go over all the bosses per area. Even though I enjoyed them all, there were some I loved more than others. Our first boss of Deltascape is Altaroit, whose name I probably butchered. This is the snake thing that was chasing Alpha at the start, so it's time to get some payback. This boss is actually from Final Fantasy V, and he usually looks like this. But when he's defeated he turns into the worm snake looking thing. This form is actually called Jura Avis. I probably butchered that as well. Also I totally didn't look up the Final Fantasy wiki for this knowledge. But yeah, Deltascape is the Final Fantasy V section of the Omega raids, just FYI. He likes to make the floor icy and then spawn fireballs that you have to slide to avoid their AoE. And he also has a mechanic that I'm not a fan of in games where you get hit for 99% damage and you have to scramble to recover before you get finished off. I first experienced this during the final boss of Final Fantasy XIII. I hated it then, and I hate it now. Apart from that mechanic, the fight is still decent, and thankfully the quality only goes up from here, especially the next fight. This Mike Wazowski looking guy is Catastrophe, and it's got one of the coolest mechanics I've experienced so far. Before we fight him, Nero and Sid are doing some research on the monitors to help you in the upcoming fights. They're clearly just reading the guides. But this enemy can manipulate gravity, and so Nero creates an anti-gravity gimbal that you need to use during the fight. When Catastrophe attacks the ground, you need to use the gimbal to rise above and avoid it. There's even times where there'll be damage in the air and on the ground, and you need to levitate at the right moment to avoid the ground damage, and then also avoid the AoE in the air. He even has the usual stack attack, but you need to be levitating to actually absorb it. It's just a really cool fight with a very interesting mechanic, one that I've actually not seen before in MMOs. The next fight is against Halicarnassus, god I'm absolutely butchering these words aren't I, who's actually the final boss in Hawkeye Manor Hard. A very infamous fight to new sprouts. I can say that this fight is much better than that one thankfully. It's here that the group start to figure out that Omega's actually drawn upon others' conception to create these tests for us to complete. In other words, Omega's doing a Google search for Final Fantasy bosses to throw at us. Back to Halicarnassus, she's sporting a new look from the Hawkeye Manor fight. She actually reminds me of the hero design from Final Fantasy I. She's also known as the Croak Queen. I'm not sure if she was called this during the Hawkeye Manor stuff, but hey look, I'm a frog. This fight has a few cool mechanics in it, with one obviously being the standout. She places down job markers that you have to stand in, so if you're DPS, stand in the red sword, and sometimes these tiles can turn into frogs, which means you need to be turned into one and then stand on it, otherwise you'll take damage. There's a mechanic that makes you run in whatever direction you're facing. She likes to do this and then use the stack attack, so you'll have to try and get back to it before you die. You also need to stand on blue tiles at one point, otherwise you'll get spiked by the ground. She even spawns a dragon to come help her out. But the highlight of this fight is when she opens up an ethereal tear and you need to go into it and complete her challenge to continue the fight. You'll be transported to a desert and you need to surf across the sand and choose the correct path to get out and back into the fight. It's pretty random, but it's a fun puzzle to do that doesn't actually involve fighting. I've seen plenty of people reference this to the Pokemon Red Blue Team Rocket hideout. You know, the one where you've got to ride across the tiles and you're spinning and you just have to choose the right ones to choose the correct path. I'm actually angry I didn't pick up on this when I played it, because it is exactly that, and I grew up on Pokemon Red and Blue, so I'm mad that I didn't notice it. It's only the third fight, but I can already see why everyone thinks the raids in Stormblood were very good. Already I'm seeing new mechanics and even twists to already existing mechanics. The final fight of Deltascape is against Xdeath, another boss from Final Fantasy V. Before you go in, you get told he's a tree, and of course I'm thinking, oh, this will be like fighting the Great Deku Tree from Zelda. Imagine my shock when I seen him. Oh my, that is not a tree. That is not a tree. That is Shovel Knight. But thankfully he does turn into a tree during the fight. Now he's a tree, there we go, there's the tree. He looks like Freddy Krueger. This guy loves spamming thunder, fire, blizzard, your typical black mage. But he draws power from a void orb outside the arena, which will make these spells stronger and have different effects. He also has a knockback, which the first time he does, you'll hit the railing on the arena and you'll be fine. But then the second time he does it, you realise the railing's actually broke off. There's also meteors, black holes, and they can make you turn on your teammates during the fight. It's a solid fight, but it would have been better if he was a tree the whole time. And with that, we finish Deltascape and we move on to the next section, Sigmascape. Before we start Sigmascape, we decide to leave and rest up, but Omega has other plans. It wants to subject us to severe stress. Omega determines that the best way to do this is to kill a couple of our comrades, and it chooses Biggs and Wedge. And here is my reaction to this news. Nothing against the two of them, it's just I'm just a bit indifferent towards them. But then Omega does something truly repulsive. Oh no, not the dancing girls and Alda. No, don't do it. Take Biggs and Wedge, not them. So we head back into Omega's world and Alpha is suddenly an astrologian. Maybe he can teach me how to play. But like before, we make our way to the Sigmascape and we make camp just outside it. And we get a glimpse of what's to come in the next fights. Yes, these ones are based on Final Fantasy VI, and the next fight is quite possibly my favourite fight of the Omega raids, and possibly my favourite trial so far in the game. So, you enter Sigmascape version 1, you find yourself on a train passing through a spooky forest, when suddenly you're under attack, not by a monster, but a train. The Ghost Train! Fans of Final Fantasy VI will immediately recognise this boss fight, and even if you don't know, you're still going to have a good time with this one. The Phantom Train is like the big book monster from Great Google Library, in that you can only attack it from the front, you can't get behind it. But this boss rams into the platform you're on, it spawns ghosts that if you stand inside them too long, you immediately die. It shines a light on the platform and you can guide it towards the ghosts to remove them from the platform. This train is absolutely out for blood, it even changes tracks to go alongside you to let the zombie passengers out to attack. You even get launched onto its roof to fight the chimney. And then after that you have to go inside a ghost to be transported within the ghost train, kill a ghost in the room, and then it allows you to return to the platform. At the time I had no idea why all this happened, but apparently smog covers the platform that you stand on, and to get rid of it you all need to kill the ghosts in the train. This fight is just crazy, absolutely crazy. You're already in shock realising you're fighting the train from Final Fantasy VI, and then you get thrown onto its roof and then you're fighting ghosts and it just goes 100 miles an hour. You could say this fight has gone off the rails. Sorry. If you've ever played Ocarina of Time or Luigi's Mansion, I know, what a random example, then you might be familiar with enemies using paintings to fight you. In Ocarina of Time, the Phantom Ganon goes into the paintings and then emerges from a random one to attack. In Luigi's Mansion, you deal with a painter ghost who spawns enemies by painting them on a canvas. The next boss, Chardonnok, actually reminds me of them. It'll draw power from the paintings in the corners of the room. You then need to use your paintbrush, once again another invention from Nero that comes into play here. Honestly, Nero was the MVP of this expedition so far. So you use the paintbrush to paint on one of these 4 books on the ground to counter what the boss is doing. The boss is going to flood the room. Paint over the rock so you can spawn a boulder that keeps you safe. The boss is going to cause an earthquake. paint over the flying ship so you can float over danger. It's a cool fight, but one I could see being a bit of a chore if you have to do it constantly. And by constantly, I mean you get it more than twice a week in roulettes. During all this, Omega's realised that we weren't too bothered about Biggs and Wedge nearly dying, and so it sets its monitor on the MVP of the team so far, that slimy Nero, and attacks him while he's alone. Yay! Nero's dead, let's go! It was the kettle all along, I knew it. Surprisingly, he's still standing when we come back, but you can tell something's not right with him. But hey, I'm sure he'll be fine. Oh look, another boss, let's go! Right, I just want to get this one out of the way, because this might be my least favourite one so far. The only cool thing it does is it uses other bosses' mechanics and even spawns them into the fight, such as the octopus enemy and its tentacles. Didn't I see you in Hildebrand? It also uses the pink dot mechanic from the final boss of the Great Grubel Library. You know the one, the big wardrobe. But yeah, this fight isn't bad, it's just forgettable. And it probably doesn't help that what comes after this fight involves one of the most infamous characters in Final Fantasy history. Right, I don't need to give a big introduction, you already know who this is. Look at that dude go! So you're told before the fight that Kefka would try and trick you with his attacks, and I actually predicted how he would fight. He lays down AoE attacks with question marks in them that you actually have to stand in to avoid them. They actually make this mechanic really easy to avoid. I wonder if originally they didn't have the question marks in them, but then it was a lot harder and not as fun to try and figure out what you're meant to stand in and what you're meant to avoid. The developers definitely put a lot of heart and soul into this fight. I mean, it is Kefka after all. His model looks great, the animations, even using the Warren Triad statues outside the arena to assist him in attacking you was a really cool moment. And also terrifying because I kept getting hit by them. Of course, all the while Dancing Mad is playing in the background. I thought he might have changed into his god form near the end of the fight, but he didn't. Maybe they didn't want to spoil it for players who haven't played Final Fantasy VI. Either way, this fight is great, and it's one I'll definitely enjoy playing again in the future. It's just not quite as good as the train though. And so we've completed Deltascape, and oh no, Nero's fainted! And he's turning purple! Again! I'm still not quite sure what attacked him and why he's turning purple again. I thought maybe Omega put a worm up his nose or something, you know, put something in him. Not in that way. I mean something like the worm that gets put into Neo in the first Matrix movie. And I thought it was going to come up later in the story, but yeah, Nero faints, and then Omega traps me in the same prison as Shinryu, and basically says, hey buddy, you better get out there within 3 minutes or I'm going to kill you, lol. Wee Alpha tries his best to break you out by turning into a frog. Look, he's trying his best, okay? But finally, Midgar Sommer decides to actually do something, and transforms back into his big self and breaks me free of the prison. But in doing so, he actually uses up what little energy he has in reserve, and then he disappears once again. I'm not sure if this will be the last we see of Midgar Sommer. Sid does say that he's went back to sleep, so maybe we will see him at some point in the future. Omega decides not to immediately kill us, and gives us a couple more challenges before we fight him. But first we head back to Ralga's Reach to get Nero some medical attention, and discuss what we do next. And it's during this next part of the story that we get a lot of Sid screen time, and we learn a little bit more about him. We already know that he was born in Garlemund and defected to Eorzea, but we haven't really heard much about his thoughts and feelings about it. Speaking to Jessie, she reminds you of Sid's father being the one who created the lunar transmitter, the device that was going to bring the Red Moon Dalamud crashing down onto the world, that ended up destroying the surrounding area it was stationed in. Since that incident, Sid only wants to create technology that can help people and not be used in destructive ways. However, dealing with the threat of Omega and even Nero try to convince him to embrace his genius and create technology with more destructive tendencies causes Sid to start actually shaking. I think this is also part of the reason why in A Realm Reborn he has amnesia, because part of him wanted to forget the horrors he witnessed. You know, such as the Calamity, Bahamut being unleashed into the world, the lunar transmitter disaster and his dad actually dying. But Sid steals his resolve and vows to put an end to Omega, as he feels responsible for its activation. He embraces his Garlean heritage and he gets a hold of some research notes for the lunar transmitter itself, and with this he creates a device called the Omega Jammer, which will come in handy later when fighting Omega. And now we come to the final section of the Omega raids, Alphascape, and the first fight we have is against Chaos. This fight can go two ways depending on if he uses an attack called Damning Edict at the beginning. If Chaos does use this move, he'll then use Tsunami and Earthquake attacks, and if he doesn't use the move, he'll use Fire and Wind attacks. Might as well call this guy Earth, Wind and Fire. When I fought him, he didn't use the move, so we had to deal with the Fire and the Wind. He does a couple cool attacks. He does the AoE attack that covers the whole stage, but then when it hits you have to then stand back on the bit that just hit to avoid the other bit. There's also a part where he does a double stack attack and your group needs to split into 2 teams to absorb it. He does a move called Big Bang, which is your usual AoE on the ground that's easy to avoid, but it can instantly kill you. Especially when the raid mage on your team hits the limit break free and then you can't see it on the ground. It was a decent fight, a nice warm up for the final fights. Immediately after you're finished here, Omega transports you to another world, the homeworld of Midgardsormr himself, and he wants you to fight Midgardsormr in his prime. Of course Sid tells him that's a lot of rubbish, so Omega agrees and lets us go back to camp. You know, for a machine Omega, you're kinda dumb. And when we get back to camp, Sid is invisible. No, it's not that his model just didn't load in properly, he's actually just invisible. Apparently the cards that Alpha's been using have some interesting side effects, especially the water card. These all seem kinda random at the moment, but trust me, they come up later in the story. So after resting for a wee bit, we head back into Midgardsormr's world and fight the father of dragons himself, now with hair. And holy fuck does this guy like to spin during the fight. It's a pretty simple fight all things considered, but it's cool to see Midgardsormr in his prime when he fought Omega. He does do some attacks that are similar to the dragons you might have fought in the past. It makes sense though, because he is the father of dragons after all. There's even a bit during the fight where he spawns 8 keys that you need to kill. It's kinda like Ifrit's nails. Yeah, it's just a straightforward fight. But now we move on to the main event, Omega itself. 2 words, starboard, larboard. I think it's safe to say everyone who does this fight the first time always messes this up. I know for a fact I'll probably get this wrong in the future every time I play this one. Larboard means Omega's left, starboard means Omega's right. Here's a drone. During this fight he spawns these flying fists as well to try and hit you with, and this is where you use Sid's jammer to take them out. I like the fight, but I felt it was kinda lacking. I felt like Omega went down a bit too easy. But that's because I didn't realise what was coming next. After we defeat Omega, he gets mad and actually acts like a sore loser. And it says, you know what, fuck this experiment, I'm gonna destroy the virtual world with you in it. You lose, lol. And it does just that. And so, the world has been erased, and the only thing left is Alpha. He hears Omega's thoughts and begins to make his way across this recreation of space, which is actually what Omega said he would do, since Alpha was created by Omega to lure in new potential challengers for Omega to fight, and then he would return to it, to begin the process all over again. We also hear Omega pursuing Midgardsormr to our world. We hear how it passed dead stars or dying stars. These could be the other worlds that we've heard that exist. Alpha eventually reaches Omega, who after erasing the world now resembles a giant metal ball. I'm not sure if this is the true form or just a deconstructed version. Oh yeah, remember when I said Alpha's weird card effects would come into play again?
Hello there.
We fooled Omega into thinking we were dead, but we were actually here the whole time. Omega takes on a human form to fight us with, believing it will find out why we're the strongest beings it's fought so far.
Oh no, he's hot!
This is of course the male form, but it does turn into a female as well. Out of the Alphascape fights, this is definitely the best. The male and the female forms have their own attacks. The male focuses on blade attacks and energy blasts, while the female uses magic attacks and her legs actually turn into blades. It's like that assassin girl from Kingsman. Eventually Omega splits into the 2 of them and you have to fight both forms at the same time. They start bombarding you with their own individual attacks, they spawn meteors, they start hitting you with their own limit break attacks. It's just absolute chaos, but it's very fun. And eventually you defeat both forms and Omega is finally defeated. In Omega's last moments, it laments how it could not understand how humanity gets its strength, but Sid says what humanity has is heart, and the unbreakable spirit of never giving up. Sid, you missed it, the power of friendship in the anime part. And with that, Omega comes to some sort of understanding and vanishes. Suddenly Biggs and Wedge come in raiding Racefalgar. Never thought I'd ever say that in my life. How did they get here? How did Biggs and Wedge even meet Racefalgar? I have several questions. But it turns out Midgardsormr spoke to Racefalgar and asked him to help us escape Omega's virtual world. And I guess he just happened to pass by Biggs and Wedge and asked them if they wanted a lift. We returned to Ralgar's Reach and we found out Nier was already left. And he also left a massive bill for Sid to pay. This man really went to the toilet and jumped out the window to avoid paying the bill for the meal. We also get a nice little conclusion to Alpha's story. He becomes a real boy like Pinocchio. And he goes out into the world to explore alongside the wind-up OMG companion. Don't go to Limsa La Minza, don't do it. So I'll repeat what I said at the start of the video, I think the Omega raids are the best I've experienced so far. The fights overall were really good, with a few of them being outstanding. And I really enjoyed hearing more about Sid and his backstory. I felt in the Alexander raids he was just there to do tech stuff and that was it. In this he actually felt like a proper character. Nero, I love-hate this guy. I'll roll my eyes in dread at the next time he shows up, but I can't wait to see him and Sid's ongoing shenanigans. May they continue forever. And hopefully I'll get to bump into Alpha and the OMG in the world at some point. And if you want to join me on my Final Fantasy XIV journey, then please subscribe for more videos, catch me live on Twitch while I'm playing through it, and yeah, I'll see you guys later.